Daily Bible readers. Mike's going to count them, please. And then Barry has extra books in his hand. If you need a quarterly, if you'll raise your hand, he's going to come down the aisle and has those for you. I spent last quarter teaching the high school kids, which is an experience. This quarter we're studying the book of Daniel. And one of the things that's unique about Daniel, when you look back and think about it, and it's been mentioned before, but we don't hear anything, lots of our Bible heroes, for lack of a better term, we see both the goods and the bads. Moses, Noah, all of them. Saul and Paul. We see the bad things they did, we see the good things they did. But there's nothing bad mentioned about Daniel. So he's kind of an interesting study, if for nothing other than that. But this quarter we're studying the book of Daniel, and the Babylonian captivity is one of the darkest periods of Jewish history. If you'll remember, there were hundreds of years where the Jewish people rebelled against God. Their leaders led them away, led them to idols. They intermarried. They just did everything in the world against what God told them to do. And finally God had enough. So he lets King Nebuchadnezzar's army come down and take over the Jewish people. And the first trip through, the first capture, for lack of a better term, he takes all the talented young people and marches them back to Babylon and makes them serve during this time. And that's how Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego all came to live in Babylon. We noticed in our first lesson that Chris taught, we noticed that he throws them into a 3-year training period. And basically, they were trying to break them down. They were trying to change them completely. They changed their culture. Of course, they'd already changed where they lived by taking them north to Babylon. They tried changing their diet. They tried, as we'll see in coming weeks especially, they tried to change their religion, just completely change their customs to recreate them in a different way. Last week, we talked about a troubling dream that this King Nebuchadnezzar had. And I don't know, I never was clear about whether the king could not remember the dream and he wanted the wise men and the astrologers and the magicians to come and remind him of what that dream was. He knew he was troubled, but it never says for sure, the Bible never says for sure whether he remembered the dream and just wanted them to interpret it, or if literally, like we have dreams today, he had this dream and left him. You know how we've all woken up with this kind of sick feeling, this scared feeling, but we can't remember why. We can't remember what the dream was. Well, maybe that's what happened to him. But either way, he wanted to know what the dream was, and he wanted to know what it meant. So that's a lot of what we talked about last week. In all the people, all the men he had hired that were on his staff that were supposed to be able to do these great things, all they could do was shake their head. No, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't know what your dream was. And if we don't know what it was, we sure can't tell you what it meant. Now, always before it would seem, when he asked them things, they could come up with something. Whether they were bluffing or not, I don't know. But they could come up with some answer. But here, what we studied last week, they had no answer for it. What we're going to talk about today, and we're going to read the text in a minute, we're going to see that Daniel is able to relate both the dream, the details of it, and what it meant. But Daniel was very careful, and as we read through this, I want you to watch. that he was very careful to not to take credit for knowing what the dream was, for being smarter than the Chaldeans. He was very careful to give all credit to God and to try to tell Nebuchadnezzar that there was a greater something out there. So we're going to talk about that some more in a minute. One thing I want to point out, not just about today's lesson, but in lessons to come, as widely known as this incident was in the Babylonian Empire, apparently, it was a big deal. All the wise men, all the astrologers, all the magicians, they couldn't do what Nebuchadnezzar wanted done. And because of that, they were going to be punished. And everybody was afraid for their life. So as widely known as this was, when Daniel was able to solve the problem, explain it to them in a way that everybody kind of understood, and fewer people lost their lives, it amazes me why the king didn't see from this that there is a greater God. But we're going to see in coming weeks that still the Jews were punished for their religion, not just by this king, but by another king that came along. And it shows me the stubbornness maybe of people. That's true. I don't know. Could be. Turn to Daniel 2, 26 through 44. We're going to read this. This is our text this morning. If you have one of the books, it's on page 21. Daniel 2, 26 through 44. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" Now, let me, just for context, tell you what's happened between last week and this week. Again, we left it off last week. The wise men, the magicians, the astrologers, they couldn't come up with an answer. So everybody's hustling around, and Daniel speaks to his supervisor, for lack of a better term, and tells him, "Hey, I can tell the king the dream." Well, the man goes to Nebuchadnezzar, and almost in a way, if you read it, almost taking credit for the fact that he's found someone that can relate this dream. So everybody's trying to get on Nebuchadnezzar's good side. So now verse 27, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be." So basically, in plain language, King Nebuchadnezzar was doing what we do a lot of times. He's laying around wondering what the future is going to hold. And God tells him. "But as for me," verse 30, "but as for me, the secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image of its feet, on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces." So basically the statue's broken down. "Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, basically, think about what it said. It talked about it was this great image, but all of a sudden it's struck down and it's blown away like it never was there. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, He has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, the kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men. But they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. You know, throughout the ages, God's communicated with man in a lot of different ways. In 1 Samuel 3, 1 through 14, God spoke directly to the young Samuel. In fact, it was confusing Samuel because he would run back and forth to Eli because he thought he was hearing Eli speak out to him, yell out to him, whatever. On Wednesday night, we read in Matthew 3:17 how God spoke to the witnesses of Jesus' baptism, and He told them, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased." In Matthew 17:5, again, God spoke to Peter, James, and John, and Jesus was there also. And He said, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased." So He spoke to them directly. And He told, at the time, by the way, He told them to listen to Jesus. At other times, He spoke through prophets. And this lesson today is an example of that. Daniel was a prophet. He was trying to relate to the people, to those that were around, what God wanted, what was coming. It was just another way of communicating. And then, of course, today He communicates to us through the Bible. And we talk about the Bible being a living book. And sometimes we wonder, well, what do you mean by a living book? But what it means is that this book was written almost 2,000 years ago. And still today it's got the answers for any questions, any problems, any situations we might get ourselves into. Now we have to study the Bible. We have to look for the answers. But the answers are in there. And it's, you know how, I think all of us have had the feeling where you were reading a certain scripture or a passage and it all of a sudden the light comes on and you think, I've never thought of it that way before, or that never dawned on me before. It's just the way the Bible works. Or maybe it's the way humans react to the Bible. I don't know how that works, but we all know what happens. The point is God communicates to us today through the Bible. Back then, God didn't just communicate with followers of His. Abimelech in Genesis 23 through 7 and Pharaoh, Genesis 41, 1 through 8, both had dreams in which God revealed important and to them troubling information. We remember the example of Herod's wife, or Pilate's wife. She warned him off. I've had this dream. Don't hurt this man. Wash your hands and get away from him. Of course, it didn't work out. But anyway, as He had done with these foreign rulers, God used a dream to convey the truth to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He was telling him, this is what's coming. This is what's going to happen. And that's what we've been reading this morning. The explanation of the dream that Daniel gave to Nebuchadnezzar, I guess it helped, maybe this is just my reading of it, but it helped satisfy his anxiety. But it also presented to those around, and hopefully to Nebuchadnezzar, although I'm not sure it changed his ways at all, probably did not, in fact. But it showed him that God's the one in control. God knew what was coming. And remember, we read where it said that, verse 37, "You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom." Daniel reminded him one more time, Nebuchadnezzar, you may be a great king, but you're not the reason you're a great king. God gave him that power, gave him the chance to do that. And we, through the benefit of 2020 hindsight, one thing I want to point out, we know the Jews were, obviously they were in captivity now, but they went on being in captivity for 3 more civilizations is not the right word. 3 more rounds of different people having them in captivity. Thank you. Well, more than just generations. It was different countries had taken them over. And that's what this statue was all about. But remember, the reason I bring that up, the reason it's even important, in the Apostles' day, the Jewish leaders said, we're not in captivity to anyone, when at that very time they were servants of Rome. They were having to pass tax money up to Rome and having to listen to the Herods and the Pilates and the Roman rulers. One more time, in a very humble manner, Daniel acknowledged that God was the source of Nebuchadnezzar's answer. He did use verse 27 to point out the ineptitude, the lack of ability that the wise men of Babylon had to solve the problem of the dream. But Daniel stressed, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. Again, he gave glory to God. He didn't take it on himself. When you think of great men and some of the mistakes they made, Moses is the one that leaps to mind right now. But again, the reason Moses couldn't go over into the promised land was he got mad and struck the rock. He had that moment of pride, it looks like. And it cost him. Daniel wanted Nebuchadnezzar to know it was not one of the little g gods. It was not one of his images that were in his temples who told the future to him. It was the God in heaven, it says, who could tell him these secrets. And then again, I've already said this, but Daniel wanted it understood that he made no claim to be wiser than the Chaldeans. He was not taking credit, personal credit. He didn't use this as a chance to advance his stature or his future or whatever. Although, again, in coming weeks, we're going to read where they come back to Daniel and he solves another dream. Yeah.
I'm not mistaken, he's Persian. Daniel was actually telling Nebuchadnezzar, no matter how strong you think you are, you're going to be defeated.
Exactly.
And after that, I think the Greeks took over with Alexander the Great, and then the Romans, and then the days of those kings, the church would be established.
And notice how in these verses, I'll get to it in a minute, but one of the verses says, the empire that comes next is not as great as you are, not as powerful as you are, but they're going to take you over anyway. And basically, the author of the teacher's manual pointed out that Nebuchadnezzar was of the Babylonian reign. Nebuchadnezzar was the strongest king, and really, the Babylonians were not that strong other than while he was king. So very quickly they broke down. But the reason he was so strong, or Babylon was so strong, is they had this fortress that just was impenetrable. They couldn't break into it. But they broke up from within. So we're going to get on down. There's another lesson we'll talk about there in a minute. We've talked about already in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, the head of the image was fine gold. It doesn't mean that Nebuchadnezzar was a fine king. Nothing like that. He was king because God let him be king. He gave him that position. The chest and the arms of the statue were made of silver. The belly and the thighs of the image were bronze, and then the legs were made of iron, and the feet were a mixture of iron mixed with clay. In the dream, as the king watched, a stone seemingly appeared out of nowhere. It said it was not cut with hands. The stone appears, and it breaks up the statue completely. And, of course, it's all blown away. The first portion was Nebuchadnezzar, and we've already explained. The empire comes later, takes them over. They were the Medo-Persians. Isaiah 44:24 through 45 and 7 is when the Medo-Persians were supposedly in charge or in rulership. Although this empire conquered the Babylonians, Daniel 2:39 says they were inferior to them. So they took over, but it wasn't because they were better fighters or smarter or whatever. It was just, again, God's will that someone else take over. The third, the belly and the thighs of bronze, represented the Greeks. They were led at first by Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great is known for being a great army leader. And they controlled it for about 300 years. And then, as Don said, finally what we see, and this is what the legs and the feet were, was the Roman Empire. And then, I guess every time I think of the Roman Empire, I think of America. You know, they were in control, they were in charge, and they were the king of the heap for about 200 years. The Roman Empire was very strong, and it dominated its world. Everything outside it. We would refer to it today as a superpower. But it broke up not from someone coming in and taking them over. It broke up from inside. Corruption, and it was as if they got so strong, but they couldn't control themselves anymore. And you know, I'm saying all that to say, I just have to wonder if we're like that in America today. We've been in charge for a couple of hundred years, and we see things today that scare us all that are going on. You have to wonder if it's not God's way of showing us the things that are coming. The stone was the church. It was created by God for the redemption of mankind and for the judgment on empires of the world. Just like the stone broke up the statue, the Christian religion, the church itself, has been there through however many hundreds of years now since then, and been through whole lots of ups and downs. This divine kingdom is variously known in the New Testament as Mark 9:1 says the kingdom of God. Ephesians 5:5 talks about the kingdom of Christ. It's a kingdom that'll never be destroyed, and its power would never be transferred to another regime. It's not like what we saw before, where a few hundred years a king or kingdom reigns, and then another one comes along. There's not going to be another one after the church. There's not going to be a regime change. I guess is the point I'm trying to make. The Roman Empire, jumping back to that, to which the final section refers, did indeed act with strength, but also had this weakness that I talked about. And that's why I think, at least according to the commentaries, the feet and the legs were supposedly clay mixed with iron, or iron mixed with clay, and they weren't as strong and all that. The idea is, the figure is that there was this inherent weakness, that even though they could project power out over the rest of the world, there was something wrong inside. And I'm afraid today, like I said, sometimes we're that same way. Are there other comments? You got other things you want to point out? It's at the end of these lessons, it always has an application, or in the teacher's manual, a conclusion. And I want to read the application out of here because it kind of ties up and talks why we bother studying this lesson today. Why do we care what an old man dream was or had? But the point, I think, is the point we need to see and want to take with us is Nebuchadnezzar, as strong a king and as strong an empire or civilization as the Babylonians were, they were still in God's hand. He was only allowed to be king by God, and he was used as a tool to punish the Jewish people because of those years of rebellion. And later, these other kings came along and punished the Babylonians, and then the Greeks came along, and then the Romans came along. So still, if people didn't turn back to God, this tumbling effect kept going. Now, real quickly, bottom of page 27. It's not possible to read Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream without concluding that God is in control. That's the point we need to take home with us. No matter what, God's in control. Although great empires have existed over the course of history, the strength of those kingdoms is nothing in comparison with the power of God. He's not only aware of the events that will transpire in the future, but utilizes them to bring about His will. Remember how He punished the Jewish people by Nebuchadnezzar raising up and taking them over. The kingdoms referenced in Nebuchadnezzar's dream actually helped pave the way for the precise moment in history when Jesus came to save humanity. And then it gives Galatians 4:4 and 5, and Ephesians 1:10. So that's what we have to remember, and that's the whole purpose, I think, of studying this lesson today, is God is in control no matter what. And no matter, we think sometimes that that everyday events are things that have never happened before. How's our civilization going to go on? Well, the truth is, God's in control. I guess that's my answer to when we talk about global warming and all these other things. How can we destroy a world that God made? Yes, Daniel. I think that's important, if nothing else, than just to humble us the way we need to be humbled, but also to know that we have that responsibility to obey God and to be faithful to Him. Okay, that's the scary part. We may live to see it. Okay, I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate your attention and your comments.